She was left penniless during the divorce, but when she dropped a bombshell in court. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly as Grace sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded over a cheap leather handbag that no longer matched her former lifestyle. Her coat was borrowed, her heels scuffed, and the divorce proceedings had only just begun. Across the room, Matthew leaned back confidently in his tailored navy suit, laughing softly with his attorney as if the day's outcome had already been decided. He didn't look at Grace once, not with guilt, not with sympathy, not even with recognition. It was as if she were a stranger, just another inconvenience to cross off his list. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Grace took a deep breath. The final unraveling of 12 years of marriage was about to be finalized. The moment the judge called their names, Matthew's lawyer launched into an opening filled with cutting remarks cloaked in civility. He painted Matthew as a successful entrepreneur and Grace as a woman who had contributed little and now sought to profit from a life she hadn't built. Grace's lawyer, a tired public defender assigned through legal aid, barely countered. He didn't know the intricacies of her story, and he didn't care. Matthew leaned over and whispered something to his attorney, who chuckled audibly. Grace sat still, burning inside. The courtroom was cold, but her cheeks flushed with the sting of humiliation. She wasn't just being divorced, she was being erased. 6 months earlier, Grace stood in the driveway of the home she helped decorate, her suitcase by her feet and a trash bag filled with her clothes in hand. Matthew didn't even come outside. He simply texted, "I left you the key to the car. The battery's dead, though. You'll figure it out." After 12 years of marriage, that was it. There was no goodbye, no conversation, no decency. Grace looked up at the window of the master bedroom and wondered how someone who once promised to protect her could now treat her as disposable. She had no job, no savings of her own, everything had been in his name. And now she had no place to go. She tried calling her sister, but the phone went to voicemail. The friendships she once cherished had faded over the years, replaced by polite nods at dinner parties hosted by Matthew's colleagues. The only person who answered was her old college roommate, Melanie, who offered her couch for a few nights. Grace moved in with a small duffel bag, pretending to be optimistic, even as her world collapsed. But within days, Melanie's boyfriend made it clear that Grace's presence was not welcome long-term. Grace left silently before sunrise one morning, not wanting to be someone's burden. Her car wouldn't start, just as Matthew had said, so she walked 3 miles to the nearest shelter and waited in line behind 6 other women. That was the moment she realized she had hit bottom. The marriage had not started in darkness. Grace remembered being 25, working part-time at a bookstore, and meeting Matthew at a networking event she was only attending to accompany a friend. He was charming, ambitious, and attentive. He said all the right things. When he asked her what she wanted in life, she had said, to be part of something meaningful. Within a year, they were married. Matthew promised her she'd never have to worry about money. He insisted she quit her job to support his growing business and manage the household, and she agreed, believing they were a team. At first, he was grateful. He even thanked her publicly at company events, calling her his silent strength. But as the business grew, so did Matthew's ego. Grace went from being his partner to his shadow. He stopped asking her opinion. When she tried to discuss finances or her desire to return to work, he would respond with, "Why would you want to work when you have everything?" The nights they spent cooking dinner together turned into evenings where he stayed late with clients. He stopped wearing his wedding ring. Friends became more curated, people who praised his success and pretended Grace didn't exist. She knew things had shifted, but she kept holding on, hoping that if she just did a little more, things would return to how they once were. They never did. Grace discovered the affair by accident. One night, she needed to email herself a document from Matthew's home office computer. She had done it dozens of times before without issue. But that night, his inbox was open, and at the top was a message labeled "Tonight, face blowing a kiss." Her stomach dropped. She clicked it. The message from Ivy, his assistant, left little to the imagination: reservations at a hotel, compliments on last night, and a promise for round 2. At first, Grace thought she might throw up. But then came something colder, a stillness, a numbness that settled deep into her bones. She closed the browser and walked into the kitchen. When Matthew returned home hours later, smelling of cologne he never wore for her, she simply said, "I know." He didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. He looked at her and said, "I'm not happy, Grace. I haven't been for a long time. You should have known this was coming." That night, he didn't sleep in their bed. The next morning, he handed her a manila envelope with preliminary divorce papers. "This is best for both of us," he said. Grace opened the folder and saw the proposed settlement: no spousal support, no claim to the business, and a vague clause about amicable property division. She laughed once, bitterly. "I built your life with you," she whispered. Matthew didn't respond. He simply left the room. 3 weeks later, Grace attended a charity gala she had helped plan before the separation. She almost didn't go but thought it might help her reconnect with people who remembered her as more than Matthew's ex. The moment she arrived, all eyes turned to her. Ivy was there, on Matthew's arm, wearing the same dress Grace had worn to the gala 2 years prior. Grace's heart pounded as Ivy whispered something to Matthew, who smirked and nodded. Then Ivy approached her. "Oh, Grace. I didn't expect to see you here. I suppose old habits die hard." She looked her up and down. "Your shoes, vintage?" Grace turned without replying, cheeks burning, and stepped outside for air. She could hear laughter echoing behind her, though she didn't know if it was meant for her or not. But it didn't matter. She had never felt smaller. That night, she cried in the backseat of a rideshare, watching the life she built dissolve through the tinted windows. The next morning, her bank account was overdrawn. Matthew had closed their joint account without telling her. That was the final blow. She packed what little she had left a note on the mirror that read, "I'll be back for what's mine," and walked out into a world that didn't recognize her anymore. Grace sat across from a young attorney in a budget law office downtown. The sign outside advertised quick divorce consultation, first hour free. He barely looked up from his phone as she explained her situation. When she mentioned Matthew's company and the length of their marriage, he raised an eyebrow. "You didn't sign a prenup? And still ended up with nothing?" he asked with a smirk. She nodded, clutching her folder of documents. "And you didn't work? No career? This will be tough." He chuckled and said, "Look, I'm not saying you don't have a case, but the court rarely sides with someone who has no assets or income." Grace felt the heat rise to her cheeks. "But I supported him. I was there before the company even existed. I managed everything so he could focus." The lawyer shrugged. "That's not documented. Courts like paper trails. Unless you have something solid, this'll just be a sympathy story." The meeting ended with a forced handshake and no follow-up. Outside, Grace stood in the hallway, staring blankly at the elevator buttons. She realized that not only had she lost her husband, but the world didn't even see her as worth fighting for. As the elevator doors closed, she whispered to herself, "They have no idea who I was. Who I still am." In the weeks that followed, Grace bounced from shelters to budget motels when she could afford them. Each morning she'd wake before sunrise, wash her face in a shared sink, and try to look professional enough to walk into a business and ask for work. She applied at cafes, retail stores, reception desks, anywhere that didn't require a resume newer than a decade old. Rejection after rejection chipped away at her hope. She overheard one manager whisper, "Overqualified, but also outdated." The cruel irony stung more than any insult. She was too much and not enough, all at once. One night, her only jacket soaked from rain, Grace sat inside a 24-hour diner nursing a cup of black coffee she couldn't afford. A young couple nearby giggled, sharing a plate of fries, their hands touching in soft, familiar ways. She remembered when Matthew used to do that, steal her fries, kiss her knuckles. That felt like someone else's memory now. She pulled out her phone, battery barely hanging on, and reread a message from the shelter, "Bed space full." That night, she returned to her car with her wet clothes and a bag of crackers, praying no one knocked on the window asking her to move. When she closed her eyes, she didn't dream. There was no room for that anymore. On a cold Monday morning, Grace walked into the public library hoping for warmth and anonymity. She settled at a corner computer terminal, where the glow of the screen reflected off her tired eyes. She started building a new resume from scratch, unsure what to even list. Homemaker didn't translate well in business terms. That's when a voice beside her said, "Mind if I help?" She turned to see an elderly man in a brown corduroy jacket with gentle eyes and a cane resting against the table. He looked at her screen, then back at her. "You're more accomplished than you think." His name was Walter. He used to run a career development nonprofit before retiring. Something about Grace reminded him of his late wife, quiet strength buried under layers of disappointment. Over the next few days, they met at the same terminal. Walter taught her how to write with confidence, how to list skills like time management, budgeting, and conflict resolution in professional terms. He even bought her a flash drive. "You're rebuilding, not starting over," he said softly. Grace smiled for the first time in weeks. Maybe she wasn't invisible. Maybe someone still saw her. With Walter's help, Grace secured a part-time receptionist job at a small chiropractic clinic. It paid little, but it was enough to afford a studio apartment the size of a walk-in closet and a week's worth of groceries. She hung her coat on the wall, folded her clothes neatly into drawers, and made coffee in silence, things she once took for granted. Each morning, she arrived early, greeted patients with sincerity, and kept the office running like clockwork. Her boss, Linda, a stern woman in her 50s, watched her closely but said little at first. Over time, Linda began asking Grace to do more, organize schedules, handle billing calls, proofread clinic materials. "You're efficient," she said one day. Rare quality these days. Grace took pride in her work. Each paycheck, no matter how small, was sacred. She kept receipts, tracked every expense, and slowly began setting aside a few dollars each week. It wasn't just money she was saving, it was dignity. For the first time since Matthew had left, she began to feel like she had her feet on solid ground. She still had nothing by most standards, but she had herself again, and that was something. One rainy Thursday afternoon, after a particularly difficult day filled with late patients and computer glitches, Linda called Grace into her office. Grace assumed she had made a mistake. Instead, Linda poured 2 cups of coffee and asked, "What's your story?" Caught off guard, Grace hesitated. But something in Linda's tone felt safe. She spoke, not in bitterness, but with clarity about the marriage, the betrayal, the loss. Linda listened without interruption. When Grace finished, Linda said, "You know, I used to be someone's shadow too. Different story, same ending." Then she leaned forward and added, "I have a friend. She runs a legal clinic for women in situations like yours. Not just divorce, financial abuse, coercive control. She might be able to help." Grace blinked, unsure how to respond. No one had offered her help in weeks, not without judgment. "Think about it," Linda said, sliding over a card. "You're smart, Grace. You just need the right room to be heard." That night, Grace sat on her twin bed, staring at the card in her hand. For the first time in a long while, something stirred deep within her, something like hope, reborn. Grace stepped nervously into the modest but welcoming office of the legal clinic Linda had recommended. Posters on the walls read things like "You are not alone" and "Financial abuse is real." A woman named Serena, the lead attorney, welcomed her with a calm voice and sharp eyes. As they talked, Serena took notes, occasionally stopping to ask clarifying questions. "Did you have access to any of the business finances? Were you ever listed on property titles?" Grace felt embarrassed admitting she wasn't. Serena, however, didn't flinch. "This isn't uncommon," she said. "We've seen this before. And there are ways to fight it." Over the next few weeks, Grace attended workshops on financial literacy, asset tracing, and courtroom strategy. She learned how to interpret the tax records she'd once ignored, how to identify marital assets disguised under corporate names, and how to document her contributions to the household. One evening, sitting under the flickering ceiling light of her studio, she organized a timeline of her marriage, every sacrifice, every milestone, every instance where her unpaid labor enabled Matthew's rise. The more she learned, the angrier she became, but it was no longer helpless anger. It was focused. Controlled. She wasn't just preparing for a fight. She was preparing to win. While organizing old boxes she had salvaged during her eviction, Grace found a small black flash drive tucked into an envelope labeled "Matthew, Backup." She almost tossed it aside, assuming it contained company files or tax receipts she wouldn't understand. But something made her plug it into her laptop. What she found shocked her. The drive held spreadsheets detailing off-the-book payments, obscure shell companies, and irregular transfers, some marked with initials Grace recognized from Matthew's circle. At the bottom of one folder was a document titled Asset Diversion 2019, Private. She opened it and stared at the figures. Her hands trembled. This wasn't just financial sleight of hand, it was outright fraud. Money Matthew had claimed didn't exist during the initial separation had been rerouted to international accounts. She quickly saved a copy and printed key pages. The next morning, she brought the documents to Serena. The attorney scanned them, then looked at Grace with a mix of admiration and concern. "Do you know what this is?" Grace nodded slowly. "Leverage," she whispered. Serena nodded back. "Yes. But if he realizes you have this, he'll try to bury you. You need to be ready." Grace looked out the clinic's window at the morning traffic and said calmly, "I've already been buried. This time, I dig back." The legal team began dissecting the files Grace had discovered. With each passing day, more inconsistencies surfaced. Serena brought in a forensic accountant named Miguel, who confirmed that the hidden funds weren't just a matter of selfishness, they were potentially illegal. "This is serious," Miguel told Grace during one meeting. "He could face federal charges if this gets to the right people." Grace didn't blink. "Then let's get it to them." For the first time, the power that had once been used to silence her was beginning to shift. And it was shifting in her favor. Miguel prepared a comprehensive report. Serena contacted a journalist she trusted, while also beginning to file motions to reopen the financial aspect of the divorce. Grace now walked into the clinic like she belonged there. Gone was the hesitant woman afraid of being a burden. She had become a client with purpose, a woman others in the waiting room started to recognize and whisper about. One day, as she entered, a younger woman asked softly, "How did you do it?" Grace smiled gently and replied, "I stopped apologizing for surviving." As the legal case progressed, Grace was warned by Serena that using the documents could come with consequences. Matthew had powerful attorneys, and if they suspected her of obtaining private files unlawfully, they would retaliate. "He'll come after you hard," Serena said. "We can anonymize the source, but there's always risk." Grace didn't hesitate. "He already took everything from me, my home, my dignity, my identity. This time, I fight on my terms." Her voice didn't shake. Serena studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we'll move forward. But you'll need to be brave." That night, Grace sat alone in her apartment, staring at the growing stack of evidence beside her. She didn't cry. She didn't waver. Instead, she wrote a letter to herself, something she hadn't done in years. "This isn't revenge," she wrote. "It's restoration. You gave love, time, and years. You're not stealing anything. You're reclaiming what's yours." She folded the note, slid it into her desk drawer, and went to sleep peacefully for the first time in months. Serena arranged a meeting with a high-profile law firm that often collaborated with the clinic on complex cases. When Grace walked into their downtown office, the air smelled of polished wood and confidence. The lead attorney, a woman named Camila with a sharp bob and sharper instincts, reviewed Grace's file with meticulous care. After a long silence, she looked up and said, "You've got him. But this will be messy." Grace nodded. "I've been through worse." Camila smiled slightly and said, "Good. Because we're taking this all the way." She extended her hand. Grace shook it, firm and unflinching. With the new legal team, everything changed. No longer just defending herself, Grace became the centerpiece of a case that exposed more than a bad marriage, it exposed a fraudulent empire. Depositions were scheduled, subpoenas drafted, and whispers of a quiet audit began to reach Matthew's inner circle. Ivy, now an executive at Matthew's firm, posted increasingly cryptic messages on social media. Grace didn't respond. She no longer needed to defend herself online. Soon, she'd speak in a language Matthew finally understood, consequences. Matthew received the official court notice with a smirk. "She's trying again," he scoffed, tossing the envelope onto his marble kitchen counter. Ivy leaned over his shoulder and laughed. "You should have cut her off completely the first time." Matthew adjusted his cufflinks and replied, "She's harmless. Let her play dress-up in court." That weekend, they flew to the south of France, confident in their untouchable status. While sipping wine at a private villa, Matthew joked to friends, "It's charity, really. I gave her a taste of wealth. Now she wants the recipe." What he didn't know was that the case had reached the ears of a financial publication. A junior journalist, tipped off anonymously, had started connecting the dots between Matthew's offshore holdings and a shell nonprofit that never filed proper returns. When the journalist called his office for comment, Matthew laughed it off. "Let them publish what they want," he told Ivy. "People like me don't get caught. We get promoted." Ivy smiled, but her eyes revealed something else, a flicker of doubt. Grace sat in the clinic conference room surrounded by thick files, color-coded tabs, and whiteboards filled with timelines. The energy was electric. Her legal team buzzed with strategy, her accountant updated projections, and Serena handed her a folder labeled Witness Prep. "You're the key to this case," Camila told her. "He underestimates you. Let's keep it that way." Grace studied the pages meticulously. She no longer felt intimidated by legal language or courtroom etiquette. She belonged here now. Outside the clinic, Grace began speaking to other women in similar situations. She mentored a young mother who had fled an abusive marriage, helped another navigate housing forms, and accompanied one to a food bank. "You have a gift," Linda told her one evening at the clinic. "Not everyone makes it through this and reaches back for others." Grace smiled softly. "Someone once did it for me." Every act of kindness, every small victory, fueled her. She wasn't just preparing for court, she was rebuilding a life worth defending. The financial article dropped on a Thursday morning, and it hit hard. The headline read, "Local CEO accused of hiding millions during divorce proceedings." Accompanied by a grainy photo of Matthew and Ivy at a gala, the story detailed discrepancies in filings, suspicious overseas transfers, and connections to closed charities. Grace's name wasn't mentioned directly, but it was clear who the former spouse was. The piece went viral in professional circles within hours. Matthew's PR team scrambled to issue a denial. "This is a smear campaign," the press release read, based on unverified claims from a disgruntled ex. But the damage was done. Potential investors backed away, a charity gala Matthew was set to host pulled his name from promotions, and staff inside his company began whispering. Ivy slammed her office door shut, muttering curses under her breath. "You said she was weak," she hissed at Matthew during a tense call. "She was," he snapped back. "Someone else is pulling her strings now." But deep down, even Matthew knew that wasn't true. Grace had found her footing. And for the first time, he was nervous. The audit began quietly, with government agents requesting basic documentation from Matthew's firm. At first, he dismissed it. "Routine," he said aloud, even as his palm began to sweat. But soon the requests became more pointed: bank statements, international transfers, client contracts. Ivy's face grew pale as she scrolled through emails from concerned board members. "What if they dig deeper?" she asked. Matthew waved her off, but his jaw clenched tighter than usual. He called his lawyer. "Handle it," he said. "I don't care what it costs." Meanwhile, Grace continued working at the clinic part-time, maintaining her schedule with quiet determination. When Linda mentioned the media coverage, Grace simply replied, "He's feeling it." But she didn't gloat. Instead, she prepared harder, revisiting every detail of the marriage, memorizing timelines, refining her testimony. The pressure was shifting, but Grace knew the real battle was still ahead. In private, she practiced speaking in front of a mirror. "This is not about revenge," she told her reflection. "It's about truth." The court date arrived like a storm rolling over the horizon, slow, looming, inevitable. Grace stood outside the courthouse wearing a simple navy dress, her hair tied back, a folder in hand. Camila joined her, adjusting her blazer. "You ready?" she asked. Grace nodded once. "Let's finish what he started." Inside, Matthew arrived 15 minutes late, his suit immaculate, Ivy at his side in oversized sunglasses. He smirked as he passed Grace in the hallway. "You clean up well," he said. Too bad it's just for show. Grace didn't respond. She walked past him with her head high, heels tapping evenly on the marble floor. In the courtroom, both legal teams took their places. The judge, an older woman with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, entered with quiet authority. As the bailiff called the court to order, Matthew leaned toward his lawyer and whispered, "She won't last 10 minutes under pressure." Grace sat tall, hands still, breath steady. She wasn't just ready. She had waited her entire life for this moment. Camila stood first. Her voice was calm but deliberate, echoing through the silent courtroom. This case is not about revenge. It's about restoration. About a woman who was systematically erased from the legacy she helped build. She paced slowly, eyes meeting the jury. "We will show you the truth buried beneath the illusion of success." Matthew leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, feigning boredom. But Grace could see it, the way his fingers tapped nervously under the table. Matthew's attorney followed, his tone smug, dismissive. "My client is a self-made man." The plaintiff willingly chose a life of leisure, then changed her mind when it no longer suited her. He looked directly at Grace. "This is not courage. It's opportunism." Grace held his stare without blinking. She wasn't the same woman who once trembled in silence. She had heard enough empty speeches to know the truth wouldn't come from theatrics, but from her voice. It was the moment they'd prepared for. Serena was called to present evidence. With the judge's approval, she displayed the contents of the flash drive onto the court's screen. Transaction logs appeared, names, dates, amounts. Unfiled accounts in the Caymans. False invoices. Misreported charity donations. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Matthew's lawyer objected, citing privacy violations, but the judge overruled him. "This information is material to the case and legally admissible," she said firmly. Gasps rose as Miguel, the forensic accountant, explained each document. He spoke with precision, breaking down the shell game Matthew had used to hide millions. "These are not errors," he said. "They are intentional diversions designed to reduce marital asset exposure." Ivy looked down at her lap, avoiding the projection screen. Matthew's confident posture faltered. For the first time, his expression cracked, not with rage, but with realization. The game was no longer his to control. On the second day, Matthew was called to the stand. At first, he answered confidently, even smiling at the jury as if giving a boardroom presentation. But under cross-examination, Camila's tone sharpened. "Mr. Lewis, can you explain why funds were rerouted from the company's humanitarian arm to a private account in Zurich?" Matthew shifted in his seat. "Those were administrative decisions," he said, voice tight. "Delegated." Camila pressed. "Delegated to whom?" Silence. As more contradictions emerged, his answers grew clipped, defensive. The courtroom watched as the polished CEO slowly unraveled. "She was lucky to be married to me," he snapped, gesturing toward Grace. "I gave her a life. She just existed in it." The jury visibly recoiled. Grace didn't flinch. She had heard that tone before, behind closed doors. Now the world was hearing it too. And it didn't sound like power. It sounded like fear. On the third day, Ivy was subpoenaed. She entered the courtroom in a stiff gray blazer, her usual poise gone. As she took the stand, her eyes darted nervously toward Matthew, who avoided looking at her. When asked about her role in financial transactions, she hesitated. I followed orders, she whispered. And yes, I knew. Camila leaned forward. Knew what? Ivy closed her eyes. That the money was being moved to keep it from her. There was a long pause. Why would he do that? Ivy opened her eyes, glassy with regret. Because he knew if she ever left, she'd be entitled to half. And he didn't think she deserved it. Her voice cracked. He said she was just baggage. The courtroom was silent. Ivy was excused and walked past Matthew without a glance. Outside, reporters swarmed. But Ivy kept walking, her heels clicking faster with each step. She was running, not from Grace, but from the guilt. That evening, news stations picked up the trial. Headlines flashed across screens, CEO accused of hiding millions from ex-wife. Social media exploded. A clip of Matthew's courtroom outburst went viral. One post read, Grace Green, from discarded housewife to courtroom hero. Grace sat on her bed, watching it unfold on a borrowed laptop. She didn't smile. Instead, she closed the screen, letting the silence speak louder than the noise. Serena called late that night. He's going to offer a settlement, she said. They're scared. Grace stared out the window at the city lights. Let them be, she answered. But I'm not here for hush money. Her voice was quiet but unshakable. Across the city, Matthew sat in his penthouse, pacing as his lawyer pleaded with him to settle. She has the momentum. We can't stop this wave, the lawyer warned. Matthew didn't respond. Because he knew. The empire he built by silencing her was now crumbling because she finally spoke. As expected, the following morning brought an official offer from Matthew's legal team, an 8-figure sum, plus a gag order, and the immediate end of proceedings. Camila laid the papers before Grace, who read every line carefully. The sum was more than she ever imagined. But when she reached the clause about confidentiality, her expression hardened. He wants to buy my silence, she said quietly, after spending years erasing my voice. Camila nodded. It's your call. Grace looked up. Then let's keep going. That afternoon in court, Matthew's attorney announced the proposed settlement. The judge turned to Grace's side, waiting. Camila rose. We decline, she said clearly. A whisper rippled across the room. Grace didn't look at Matthew, but she felt his eyes burning into her. For a man who once believed he could buy or bully his way out of anything, her refusal was more devastating than any cross-examination. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about dignity. After days of testimony, cross-examinations, and exhibits, the final hour arrived. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the air inside the courtroom thickened with tension. The foreman read the verdict, in favor of Grace Green. Full recognition of spousal contributions. 50% of marital assets. Retroactive compensation. Additional penalties for financial concealment. Matthew sat motionless, lips parted slightly, as if trying to speak and failing. Grace closed her eyes as the final words were spoken. Not in triumph, but in release. Camila placed a hand on her shoulder. You did it, she said softly. Reporters stormed the hallway as Matthew was ushered away by his lawyer, dodging cameras and questions. Grace didn't stop to address the crowd. She simply walked out, head held high, heels steady against the courthouse steps. It wasn't a walk of victory, it was the walk of someone who had reclaimed her name. A month later, Grace received a letter in the mail. No return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Inside, a single page. It was from Matthew. "You were right," it began. "I didn't see your value because I was too busy trying to prove mine. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know that I see now what I refused to admit then. I was wrong. About you. About us." He ended with a line she didn't expect. "I hope someday, when you tell your story, I'm not the villain. But I know I probably will be." Grace folded the letter and placed it inside a drawer. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply closed the drawer. That chapter had been written, judged, and closed. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would be her decision, on her terms. And that was more powerful than any courtroom ruling. That day, she walked past the office where she once sought free legal advice, pausing at the door. A new woman sat inside, anxious, alone. Grace turned away, but not before whispering, "She'll find her way, too." Months passed. Grace didn't return to her old life, because she didn't want it. Instead, she began working with the legal clinic that once helped her. She became a case coordinator, guiding women through the same maze she had survived. Her story began circulating among nonprofits and advocacy groups. She received invitations to speak at conferences. Her voice, once silenced, now filled rooms filled with applause. She didn't seek attention, only truth. And that truth resonated. She eventually founded a nonprofit of her own, one focused on financial literacy and legal support for women exiting controlling marriages. "It's not about revenge," she would tell every woman she mentored. "It's about rebuilding what was taken from you, brick by brick." Her name became a symbol of quiet strength. She didn't need to shout to be heard anymore. She simply stood, and people listened. On a cool spring morning, Grace walked past the courthouse where everything had changed. In her hand, 2 coffees, one for herself, the other for a young intern waiting at the clinic. As she turned the corner, she noticed a woman sitting alone on the bench near the entrance, tears threatening to spill. Grace approached slowly. "You here for something hard?" The woman nodded. "I don't even know where to start," she said. Grace handed her the second coffee and sat beside her. "You don't need to know everything today," Grace replied. "You just need to know you're not alone." The woman looked at her, a question in her eyes. "You've done this before?" Grace smiled softly. "Something like it." And as the sun rose over the courthouse steps, illuminating the city in golden light, Grace felt something she hadn't in years, not victory, not relief, but peace. Because the life she rebuilt wasn't built on fear or silence, it was built on truth.